All right, so first things first. Okay, my mic is working. Excellent. All right, so actually, he just did this part, so we can skip it. Cool. All right, so two new things in this presentation. We're going to have two new attacks. One is a hostile portal attack, and you can use that to steal Active Directory credentials from WPA2 EAP networks without direct network access. And the second thing we're going to go over is the indirect wireless pivot, which you can use to bypass NAC mechanisms. So before we do any of this stuff, we need to talk about WPA2 EAP. Now, the cool thing about WPA2 EAP is that it's very vulnerable to rogue AP attacks. So in order to really talk about EAP, we need to talk about rogue APs. And rogue APs, they're pretty much the bread and butter of modern wireless pen tests. You can use them for stealthy man-in-the-middle attacks, stealing radius credentials, all kinds of really cool stuff. At their core, the way that they work, the most simple type of rogue AP attack is the evil twin attack. And that is, if you look at this diagram that we have here, pardon me, if you look at this diagram that we have here, we have like 4 laptops that are connected to this access point. And this access point, just to pick on DEF CON a bit, but we'll call this network DEF CON open. And this is an open network. So I guess the question is, if an attacker were to create another access point with this very, very same name, how would these devices know which one to connect to? And the truth is, it would really come down to who has a better signal-to-noise ratio and better signal strength, among other things. So essentially, what this allows you to do as an attacker, you can just create your own hotspot, mimicking the network that you're targeting, and this will force devices to connect to you. Now you have a man in the middle, and you can do all kinds of cool stuff with that. So this is not a new attack. I mean, these have been around for pretty much like the inception of Wi-Fi. So, we're talking 2002 is when the evil twin attack first started to kind of emerge. Fast forward a couple of years, we have Karma attacks, and that's a different attack by Dino Diazovi and Shane McCauley. That's if you use like a pineapple, that's pretty much what it's doing. Fast forward to 2008, and we have Free Radius WP by Josh Wright and Brad Antoniewicz. And this is actually where you start to see rogue AP attacks used as a method of stealing credentials from radius networks. And then back, fast forward a bit to 2014, by this point, Karma attacks have been significantly less effective. So, at this point, two really awesome researchers, Dom White and Ian DeVilliers, they actually figured out how to improve this and kind of, get back to square one and make this a really effective attack again. And finally, in 2017, very recently, we have the Lure 10 attack, which targets Wi-Fi sense, which is used by Windows. So, one thing that all these different, this evolution of rogue AP attacks have in common is the fact that the rogue AP attack kind of primarily falls into one of two roles: man-in-the-middle attacks for stealing credentials, and also breaching WPA2 networks to gain access to the wireless network. We're going to do something a little bit different in this talk today, and that's using rogue AP attacks as a means of lateral movement. All right, so now that we've gone over rogue AP attacks, so when we talk about WPA2 EAP or WPA Enterprise, we're usually talking about two implementations of this EAP. So we're talking about EAP PEEP and EAP TTLS. Anyone here familiar with EAP at all? All right, some. Okay, cool. So just a brief overview of how this works. What we see here is a diagram, and this client over on the left side, this is your client device, also known as the supplicant if you want to be technical. That's like your laptop, your cell phone, whatever. And this over here is the authentication server. Now, the authentication server, when the client wants to connect to the network, the client's going to send an authentication request to the authentication server. And the authentication server is going to respond with an X509 certificate. And, once this happens, we at this point completes, provided, by the way, that the client accepts the certificate. At this point, we complete the outer authentication, and we move on to the inner authentication. The outer authentication can only proceed once the client has established that it can trust the server. So we finish the outer authentication, and then the secure tunnel is established between the client and the authentication server. We move to the inner authentication at this point, which is where you actually enter in your username and password, and all this happens through the secure tunnel. Now, the reason, by the way, why we need the secure tunnel is the fact that, so EAP, right? We're talking about EAP as an authentication mechanism. Basically, what that authentication mechanism is providing you access to is access to this Wi-Fi network, Wi-Fi network's WPA capabilities. Until you finish this authentication mechanism, this is entirely happening over open Wi-Fi because you can't get that encryption until you finish authenticating. So without the secure tunnel, you could actually sniff this entire process offline, and you'd have problems. In fact, legacy implementations of EAP were very susceptible to this. EAP MD5 is one that comes to mind. So, when I mentioned there are actually two components here, that's actually a bit of a, oversimplification. We actually have three components in total. The supplicant or wireless client, which we were talking about earlier, that's communicating with the authentication server. Well, your wireless client is actually communicating over layer 2. So in order to make this work, we actually need something that's able to speak layer 7, which is what your radius server speaks. So that's why you need the access point in the middle, which is technically known as the authenticator, but we can just call it the AP. And that just kind of sits in the middle of this whole transaction and acts as a mediator between these two parties. So, our complete diagram actually would look like this. It's very similar to what we had before. You see the authentication request, the X59 certificates returned as a response. The client then trusts it or does not trust it. But the key difference here is that we have the authenticator operating as an intermediary between the client and the server. So we mentioned that open networks are susceptible to evil twin attacks, where these attacks where you can actually force devices to connect to a rogue access point and attack them in that way. Well, and we also mentioned that EAP, until the CAP process completes, this entire network is going to be operating over open Wi-Fi. So it follows then that this entire process should be attackable using rogue AP attacks. And actually, that is traditionally how you would gain access to WPA2 enterprise network. It's essentially you create your own, your own wireless access point with its own authentication server running in the background, spoof the target network, and force the client device to connect to you. At this point, you present the client device with an X59 certificate. If the client accepts the certificate, a secure tunnel is established with you. And at this point, the client authenticates with you, and you're able to essentially get a MS-CHAP-V2 challenge and response, which can be cracked, and that gives you radius credentials. This attack was first talked about by Brandon Tonywitz in 2008. And essentially, it's been around for a really long time and hasn't really fully been addressed yet. So we mentioned MS-CHAP-V2 as the inner authentication mechanism that's used, to once we finish the outer authentication, the thing that happens to the secure tunnel. The inner authentication mechanism used by EAP-PEEP and EAP-TTLS is called MS-CHAP-V2. And MS-CHAP-V2, there are a couple ways that we can crack those MS-CHAP-V2 challenge responses that we captured. The first one is a straight dictionary attack, so you just sequentially iterate over passwords. Anyone kind of see why that might take a long time? Yeah. Well, actually, we're actually in luck because MS-CHAP-V2 is actually vulnerable to something called a divide and conquer attack. So basically, two researchers named Moxie Marlinspike and David Holton back in 2012, they figured out that you could actually, the MS-CHAP-V2 essentially was very, very similar to 3DES, and you could actually reduce it to 56 bits of DES encryption, similar to what you can do with NTLM v1. And because of this, you can actually, crack these things very, 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 very fast. And in fact, with their FPGA-based cracking rig, they can actually do it in, under 24 hours with 100% success rate. That's regardless of the length of the password. So in other words, to summarize, you have a situation in which with EAP-PEEP and EAP-TTLS, you can force devices to connect to you, to authenticate with you, and then once you get those hashes that they send you in this authentication process, you can crack them very quickly due to cryptographic weaknesses. So here's just a quick demo of essentially what this attack would look like. The attacker would create a certificate and then would create the rogue access point. And you can, as you can see here, right, the access point's enabled, and you'll see a MS-CHAP-V2 challenge and response kind of pop up on the screen after the client associates and finishes authenticating. And this will happen very shortly. I'm going to speed this along a little bit. There we go. So yeah, the attacker then takes the MS-CHAP-V2 challenge and response. In this demo, it's just like a dictionary attack because the divide and conquer, this takes a little more time and a little more work. So, but in this case, you could just, whoops. It's a very sensitive keyboard. All right, there we go. I'm gonna leave that alone. So at this point, you take the challenge response, feed it to ASLeap, which is this tool that does a dictionary attack upon them. And from there, it will crack the password. In this case, it's a really simple password, so it's gonna get it very quickly. But this could take a lot of time if you do the dictionary attack with a complex password. So yeah, that's the traditional weakness of EAP-PEEP and EAP-TTLS, is that you can do that. You can capture credentials that way. The solution that was kind of introduced to mitigate this issue was something called EAP-TLS. And EAP-TLS was introduced in 2008 and essentially uses a mutual certificate-based authentication for the outer layer of authentication. So in order to pass that outer layer of authentication, basically both the client and the server have to present valid certs to one another. So this actually stops the rogue AP attacks that we talked about earlier dead in their tracks. The problem with EAP-TLS is that you now have a situation, any network administrators out there? Anyone ever just sysadmins, anyone? Wow. Okay, none. Okay, well, essentially, essentially the problem is, if you can imagine, you're running a network, and you now, in order to deploy this thing, you now have to install a client server on every single device on your network. That can be kind of painful and time consuming. And if you have like a really large, enterprise network, it can also cost a lot of money if it's not something that, you're already equipped to do. So essentially, as a network administrator, you kind of, end up with this classic security versus convenience scenario, where you kind of have authentication mechanisms that you can choose, but they have like known weaknesses, but they're still pretty easy to use. Or you have a very, very secure, but also very impractical method of authenticating the network. So, essentially this creates a market gap. And this market gap can be, is for products that can essentially compensate for the security issues found in EAP-PEEP and EAP-TTLS, but are also easy to use. So, I mean, the current trend in this regard is to focus on breach containment rather than breach prevention. So in other words, you acknowledge the risks associated with using these implementations of EAP and say, you know what, it's too expensive to deploy EAP-TLS. Instead, we're going to focus on making sure that once an attacker gets on the network, that they can't do any damage. So you focus on breach containment. And what we're going to try to answer today is whether this actually works. I'm just going to flip through this cartoon here before we continue. I can't draw, as you can see. All right, so so I mean, the most common way of approaching the problem of breach containment is to use a NAC. And that's reasonable, right? Because a NAC mechanism or a NAC appliance, in case you don't know what it is, it's a device that essentially is able to distinguish between authorized and unauthorized network endpoints. So in other words, you connect a new device to the network, and the NAC is going to do some kind of magic. We'll go more into that later. And by doing this, it's able to identify whether the new network is authorized or unauthorized to be there. And if it's unauthorized, it's going to put it in a quarantine VLAN, where it can't really do anything, or it's going to block the port entirely. You can't really kick the device off the network because the device obviously can get back on the network in the first place. This is why we're using a NAC. But anyways, traditionally we have two varieties of NAC. We have agent-based NACs and agentless NACs. And agent-based NACs, I mean, essentially the way they work is you have a software component that's installed on every single authorized network on the endpoint on the network. And the software component communicates with the centralized brain of the NAC or the controller. And by doing this, it's able to report back information about the internals of these devices. And this is actually really effective. Unfortunately, you're also in another situation where you have to deploy something on every single device on your network. And this, is kind of back to square one because it's nearly as impractical as EAP-TLS. On the other side of the spectrum, we have agentless NACs. And they use purely external methods, passive fingerprinting, active scanning. And they're actually, a lot easier to deploy for this method for these reasons, because they actually don't require you to install something on every network endpoint. Unfortunately, you're also unable to examine the internals of these devices, so you can bypass them simply by masquerading as an authorized device. So, I mean, once again, this kind of leads us back to yet another, kind of iteration of this dilemma of insecurity versus impracticality, which in turn, creates another market gap. There's huge demand for solutions that offer deep interrogation capabilities of agent-based NACs, but don't have that additional overhead. And this has led to the rise of something, what we usually call the next generation, or what we usually call next generation NACs. So, which kind of position themselves to be the best of both worlds. These usually use a variety of techniques to do this. I mean, a lot of them advertise themselves as machine learning based or whatever. One really interesting one, actually, I tried to bring this device here because we have one in our building somewhere. So I actually opened a ticket to our IT department, and you can kind of guess how that went. They're actually, not only that, legal got involved and was I actually can't legally name this device, so we're going to call this vendor A. But I just want to pick on vendor A a bit because it's a really good example of a well thought out attempt to bridge this gap, but it doesn't actually work. So vendor A actually uses WMI to interrogate new devices as they're added to the network. So this is cool because it lets you, perform these deep internal checks without using an agent. And the way that this works is that, it essentially authenticates with new network endpoints over SMB using a single administrative service account. And the service account, naturally has to have remote login privileges in order to do this. It has to have pretty deep administrative privileges, DA, in order to be able to perform these internal checks. And this is cool because it lets it perform these deep interrogations. You don't need an agent. It's wonderful, except it also creates a single point of failure. You now have this device that, has God mode privileges that as soon as you put a new endpoint on the network, it tries to authenticate with it, over NTLM, which you can relay to other things. So naturally, if you don't set up your network with SMB signing, you can just start, and there's things there, you can just kind of add new endpoints to the network and then relay these authentication attempts to basically anything you want. Unless you enable SMB signing, which I guess that kind of stops user tracks from doing that. But you still have these really, really powerful hashes being sent to any new device that is added to the network. So that kind of sucks. I mentioned SMB signing. Basically, that's the process of signing packets to confirm they're authentic. But yeah, no, interesting thing about this vendor is that they actually, they do offer, if you kind of probe them about this, they do actually offer a piece of software that you can install on all your network endpoints to kind of prevent this kind of problem from occurring. But when you think about doing that, it sounds like they're talking about like an agent all over again. And considering the chief selling point here is that no agent is required, kind of back to square one again. So the reason why I bring this up is it just kind of illustrates the point that there really is no magic bullet here. Security with convenience, it really is a paradox. And it ultimately comes down, you have to have an honest business decision about how much of either one you want in any given situation. All right, now that we've talked about NACs, another cool thing we need to talk about in order to go back to what we were originally going for, which is whether this containment thing works. Let's talk about client isolation on a wireless network. So client isolation, it's typically used to prevent wireless devices from communicating with one another. You can do it on a wired network too, but on a wireless network, it's actually used as a security control. Typical use case is an open network. The way 802.11 is supposed to work, let's say we have these two laptops are connected to this network, and this AP here is supposed to act as a mediator between all traffic. So if laptop A in the bottom left, laptop B in the bottom right, top right, are trying to communicate with one another, if the AP doesn't want this to happen, it can just start dropping packets, and this won't occur. The problem is that at least on a wireless network, client isolation is a purely logical control. You can't really prevent radio transceivers from communicating with one another. And this was a point that was really seized upon by a researcher named Cedric Blanchard in 2005. And he introduced this really cool tool called Wi-Fi tap, which was later revived by Oliver Lavery of GDS way before my time there. But essentially the way it works is it reads packets from the victim to the AP using a Wi-Fi interface in monitor mode and injects responses to those packets as if they came from the AP. This allows Wi-Fi tap to actually bypass client isolation and furthermore communicate with devices on an open network without actually being associated with that network in the first place. So that's kind of like blows the whole client isolation thing out of the water. So there are some other tools that do similar stuff, but with more capabilities. So the Aircrack suite has some really, they have AirTON-NG, which is really cool because you can do this on a web network. It has TKIP-TON-NG, which lets you do this on a WPA1 network, although it's a lot slower. And there are also some theoretical attacks, which honestly I don't really believe they work, but I just kind of put them in here to be thorough. There's Hole 196, which apparently theoretically you should be able to do it on a WPA2 network. I don't really know. I've never actually seen it work. So here's a demo of how Wi-Fi tap would work, and essentially, what we're going to do here, we have 3 VMs, each represented by these terminals. The top right is going to be a VM that's going to host our access point. Actually, 2 VMs, I'm sorry. We have a host operating system, 2 VMs. And so we have the first VM, which is going to be our access point. The second VM, which is going to be our attacker, and this is on the left here where I'm kind of moving my mouse. And then in the bottom right, we're going to have a terminal that's kind of synced to our host operating system. So we've created a network using our first VM, right? A wireless network. And we're going to associate with it using our host operating system, as you can see. So we've done that. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to send 5 ICMP packets from our host operating system. So we've done that, sent 5 of them, and as expected, we received 5 ICMP responses. So there's this really cool proof of concept tool that comes with Wi-Fi tap, and it's called Wi-Fi ping. And essentially all it does is inject responses to ICMP packets. It's a really cool proof of concept because it just really easily shows that you can do this. So we're going to send those 5 ICMP packets again, but this time we're also going to be running Wi-Fi ping from the attacker's machine over here. And as you can see, despite the fact that we're sending 5 ICMP requests, we're receiving 10 ICMP responses. And this attacker here is not even associated with that network. So that really just demonstrates that client isolation is, ultimately doesn't really work if you really want to try hard at getting around it. But yeah, back to the NAC thing. We were talking about whether NACs, if they're effective or not at identifying endpoints, whether they're authorized or unauthorized. But I really think that that's actually missing the point. Because, NAC isn't really the only problem that you're dealing with on a wireless network. If you think about the role in containing a wireless breach, you're using it to prevent attackers from accessing sensitive information after the breach occurs. And the way that it does this is if an unauthorized endpoint is detected, you're going to take one of 2 actions. You're going to place the endpoint in quarantine or you're going to block the port. So in other words, violating an access control policy set forth by this NAC is going to cause the NAC to impose some kind of restriction on this device. In a wired network, this is actually a physical restriction. In a wireless network, as we just saw with client isolation, this can only be a logical restriction. So I want you to imagine a scenario. We've just actually, we're on like a pen test or something, or what, and we've just, gained access to a wireless network. And unfortunately, there's this NAC here that was kind of waiting for us, and it's placed us in a quarantine VLAN. And so we're kind of dead in the water because we want to get over here to this restricted VLAN where we can access these sensitive resources. Fortunately, we know that we have one victim device already on this network, and it's authorized. And the reason why we know that is because we would have had to attack this victim device to get access to this network in the first place, using the technique that we saw in the very, very beginning of this talk. So the question is, how do we get out of this? How do we pivot from this quarantine VLAN to the restricted VLAN? So before we talk about that, we have to review a couple things. One is LLMNR and NBT-NS poisoning. Basically, the way NetBIOS name resolution works is that you check your local cache, and also you check your LM host. So essentially, when one Windows machine wants to talk to another Windows machine on a network, right, it's first going to check its local cache and also check its hard-coded host file, which has a bunch of names and IP addresses that resolve to one another. If all that fails, it's going to attempt to use DNS. It's going to make DNS requests to local name servers. If that fails, it's going to fall back to two protocols called LLMNR and NBT-NS, which are implemented differently but basically behave the same way. And the best way to understand how LLMNR and NBT-NS work is through example. So we have two Windows computers named Alice and Leroy, and Alice wants to request a file from Leroy because Leroy is a file server. Alice does not know Leroy's IP. So Alice is going to attempt to resolve Leroy's host name both locally and also using DNS, but say this fails. At this point, Alice will fall back to LLMNR and NBT-NS, and by doing this, Alice will actually send a broadcast request to every single host on Alice's subnet. And this broadcast request is basically going to say, hey, are you Leroy? If you are, please send me a response with your IP address. And of course, every computer on Alice's subnet is going to receive this, and the idea is that only Leroy will respond. Yeah, right. So this basically creates a problem because you can just sit on the subnet and listen for these requests, and if you see one, you can just send a response to it. And essentially, provided the victim receives the response before your response before the legitimate computers, that this is going to essentially the first one's going to be considered valid. The first one that the target's going to receive is going to be considered valid. And this can actually let you force devices to send traffic to you as an attacker. So it's a really effective man-in-the-middle attack. And this is just kind of how it works, essentially. The most common tool for doing this is called Responder, by the way, written by Lawrence Jaffe. And kind of fast forward to the point where it's running. So essentially, the way this attack works is you're going to have some poisoners here, which are going to respond to these any of these NBT-NS or LLMNR requests, and you're going to also have authentication servers on a variety of ports listening for this attempt to succeed. So over here, we're actually going to open up Explorer on our victim machine named Jenkins. Yes, there is a machine named Leroy later on. And we're going to put in the name of a non-existent server. And what that's going to do, because the server doesn't actually exist, it's going to force this device to fall back to LLMNR and NBT-NS. And the result is that hashes are going to happen very quickly, as you can see. Already that caused the attacker to be able to harvest hashes. So yeah, as far as our little escape attempt here, that gives us a little bit of the way there. Let's talk about one more thing, and that's redirect to SMB. So the redirect to SMB is an attack that was developed by some people at Cylance a few years ago. And essentially the way that it works is that you force the victim to visit an HTTP endpoint. So you provide them with a URL, and this URL takes them to a server, which instantly redirects them to a rogue SMB server on your machine. So you basically redirect them to a file that you are hosting. You're not really hosting it, but you're listening on the port where it's going to try to connect to. This will actually cause them to authenticate with you, and by doing this, you can capture NTLM hashes or relay this NTLM authentication attempt. There's a variation of this where you actually redirect them to a non-existent SMB share instead, which causes them to trigger LLMNR and NBT-NS. But either way, it's a pretty fast way to get hashes. It does require social engineering. So this is the part of the presentation where we actually got to do new stuff. Everyone cheer. Yeah. We made it this far. Let me do a time check really fast, actually. Dun, dun, dun. All right, it's like 4 p.m. Good. We're doing great. All right. So hostile portal attacks, they're actually a way that you could steal AD creds from wireless networks without network access. This kind of ties into the NAC stuff we were talking about earlier, but it's more like a stepping stone that we need in order to pull off this attack. So I'm guessing you guys have seen something like this recently staying at this hotel or anywhere. Yeah, so that's a captive portal. And essentially the way that it works, it's usually used to restrict access to open Wi-Fi networks. And the way that they work is that, when you get to the network, all your DNS queries are going to be resolved to the location of that captive portal login page. All your DNS traffic is going to be redirected to the network owner's DNS server so that you're forced to use this specially configured DNS server. And additionally, they'll usually, redirect all your HTTP traffic to that login page as well. So no matter what you do, until you, either enter in credentials, pay for it, or just spoof someone's MAC address, you're forced to go back to here no matter what you do. Every time you send HTTP traffic, pretty much. So a hostile portal attack, it kind of actually ties in this captive portal concept with the redirect SMB attack. What happens is that when you launch a hostile portal, the first thing you do is you use a rogue AP attack to force the victim device to associate with you. Once you do that, now you're their gateway, so that enables you to do kind of something similar to what we saw with the captive portal, except that instead of redirecting their HTTP traffic to a login page, we're going to redirect their HTTP traffic to an SMB share on your machine. As we saw with the previous two attacks, this will actually force their browser to attempt NTLM authentication with you. So, kind of show how this works. In this scenario, we have Jenkins again, and we have a legitimate access point in the top right in this terminal, and we have the attackers over here in the left terminal. And so Jenkins, the victim, is currently associated with this network, example Wi-Fi. And here we're going to actually, send some DAuth packets, and that's going to force Jenkins to roam over from the legitimate access point to the attacker's access point. And you see it's connected here. The attacker is now going to open Internet Explorer and goes to the home page, and already we have hatches because we, sent out HTTP traffic. And actually, if you see, we're typing in the address bar there, there's like this autocomplete feature where it's just every time you type a character, it's making you HTTP requests to try to autocomplete for your little Bing search thing. And that's just sending the hashes to the attacker over and over again. So that's a basic hostile portal attack against an open network. Here we're talking about WPA EAP network. So we actually have to, bridge a couple more gaps before we can use an attack against an enterprise network. So once again, when we're talking about WPA EAP, most cases we're talking about EAP PEEP and EAP TTLS. Both of these use MS-CHA-v2 as the inner authentication method. So an interesting thing about MS-CHA-v2, it's a mutual authentication protocol. This means that the radius server actually has to prove knowledge of the supplicant's password, the client's password, for the inner authentication to succeed. So what this means is that although the attacker can force the victim to authenticate with the evil twin and use it to steal hashes, that can be cracked to access the radius network, the attacker actually cannot complete the entire authentication process, because at the very end of this authentication process, the attacker has to prove knowledge of the victim's password. And if we knew the victim's password, we wouldn't be doing this attack in the first place. So we have to find a way around this problem. And there are a couple of ways you can do this. For weak radius passwords, the legwork's actually already been done, once again, by Dom White and Ian DeVillers back in 2014. They came up with a technique called auto crack and add, which can be used for weak radius passwords to kind of get around this whole issue. And we'll talk about that in a second. And for stronger radius passwords, once again, remember that you can crack MS-CHA-v2 challenge responses very, very, very quickly. So, the solution there is simply to crack those offline, come back the next day, and then finish the attack. So, auto crack and add, the way that it works, host APD, by the way, is the name of the radius server that you traditionally use when you perform this style of attack. So, at the very end of the MS-CHA-v2 process, authentication process, this is what we're looking at actually, is the last two steps of the MS-CHA-v2 authentication process. This victim device is going to send a challenge response to the radius server, or host APD in this case. Now, host APD at this point is going to attempt to load the user's password from this very special text file that stores the stuff in plain text. Yeah, I know, it's silly. But yeah, it's going to attempt to load the user's password from the EAP user file. And, using that password that's loaded from the EAP user file, it's then going to construct this authentication response, which is used to prove knowledge of the victim's password to the victim. At this point, it sends that to the victim with the authentication success message, and the entire thing succeeds. The problem is that, as we mentioned, this spot here where I'm kind of waving my mouse, that's actually where this process is going to break down if you don't already know the victim's password, right? Because they've sent us the challenge response, but we don't have their password or NT password hash, which is password equivalent, in the EAP user file. So this is going to fail right there. So auto crack and add, it's actually a really, really cool technique. And the way that it works is that instead of immediately loading or attempting to load the password from the EAP user file, you take that challenge response and then shoot it off. You basically make an API call to a remote cracking rig that's equipped to crack these things very, very quickly. So you send this challenge and response off to a cracking rig. Kind of looks like a Tulu here in the top right, if you can notice. And then, essentially, once you crack that, you receive the API response from the cracking rig, and then you just append the cracked password or password hash to the end of the EAP user file. At this point, HostTPD, which is patched to do this, by the way, loads this password or password hash from the EAP user file as if nothing happened, uses that to construct the authentication response, and from there, this whole process succeeds. So that's auto crack and add. The second option, as we talked about, is to simply crack the credentials offline and finish the attack later. And once again, with the proper FPGA-based hardware, I can't talk today, or even just like sufficiently powerful cracking rig, you're going to get really, really good results, usually within 24 hours. So here's the same attack that we saw earlier. This time we're leveraging this attack against a WPA2 EAP PEEP network, right? We're using, it's no longer an open network, and we're using the auto crack and add technique. And as you see here, this time it's not an open network. The user is going to receive a certificate warning. This is not very descriptive, by the way. It just says, are you expecting this network to be here? Well, considering you just connected to this network a few minutes ago, probably. But yeah, as you can see, it still succeeds. And we have the NTLMv2 hash that we were able to capture using the hostile portal attack. So what does this attack get you? It gets you lots and lots of NTLM hashes. The results you get are actually very, very similar to LLMNR NBT-NS poisoning, but there are a few key advantages here. And the most glaring one is that you don't need direct network access, which makes it stealthier. You also are not limited to a local subnet. You get everything that's connected to the wireless network. It's also not a passive attack. You're not waiting for LLMNR NBT-NS requests or similar to show up on the network. You're forcing this to happen. So back to our little scenario we were talking about. We can actually build off this to do the second new thing that we're going to introduce today, and that's the indirect wireless pivot. So you can use this to bypass port-based access control mechanisms on these networks that we pretty much spent the first part of this talk talking about. So here's our scenario again. Once again, we are on this quarantined VLAN, and we want to get over to this restricted VLAN. So let's assume, by the way, we already have the victim's password hash, and we know this. 10 minutes? We're good. Awesome. Okay, so let's assume, by the way, that we already have this victim's password hash. And the reason why we know this is because we would have had to capture this to get on this network in the first place. So, assuming we have two wireless interfaces, and the first wireless interface is the one with the IP address on this quarantine VLAN, we can use the second wireless interface to use a rogue AP attack to force this victim to connect to our second wireless interface. At this point, we perform the hostile portal attack, once again using this second wireless interface, and use this to capture NTLM hashes from the victim. At this point, we crack the hashes offline. We might have to come back and pick up the attack where we left off. But at this point, we essentially kill our rogue access point, and this allows the victim to reassociate with the target network. So, at this point, this still is an authorized device. So, at this point, the device will get moved back over to the restricted VLAN, which is where we want to go. And at this point, we wait for the reverse shell, and we've successfully bypassed the NAC. A better way of doing this is to use an SMB Relay attack. Say that we have two victims, with an account that can access both. Do the same thing, force them to connect to your second wireless device, perform the SMB Relay attack from one to the other, and then once again kill your rogue AP and allow them to reassociate with the target network. Now you just wait for the reverse shell, and you bypass the NAC once again. So a quick demo of this happening. So essentially, now we have Leroy and Jenkins, by the way, that we're going to be attacking. And we have the legitimate AP is going to be over here on the left. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to force these devices to connect to us using a rogue AP attack. And you can see we just did that here. And we're going to force the second device to connect to us. And then essentially, we're going to start this SMB Relay server. We're going to use IMPacket for that. And we're going to do all of our agent handling using Empire. So the first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to grab the IP address of the victim device that we're going to try to pivot into. We're going to feed that to our SMB Relay server. We are then going to generate some HTTP traffic on one of our victim devices. And you can see this activity here. That's the SMB Relay attack actually happening. This will give us an agent on this device. And we're going to, at this point, fast forward a little bit. The way we're going to do this is we're actually going to use a persistence module that places a scheduled task on this system. And the scheduled task is going to launch a reverse shell. And this reverse shell is going to execute, once the devices are connected back to the target network, and it's going to give us that access. So something really interesting happened when I actually recorded this, which was that, I actually forgot to attach the virtual USB interface in VMware. So I was like, oh, well, this sucks because I'm going to have to re-record it. But then something really interesting happened. And actually, this is kind of why I kept this little thing in here. Essentially, I had placed 120 retries that happened over a 45-second period on this reverse shell. So in other words, when I reconnected the wireless interface and then went to kind of like clear the screens and restart this attack and just kind of pick up where I left off, I magically received, should see it pop up in a second, the reverse shell that I was originally looking for. And I thought that was kind of cool, so I left it in there because it proves a really good point about like really persistent implants. Is the fact that you can actually design something that will just doggedly try to like connect back to you, despite the fact that if it can't do so immediately. So that's the indirect wireless pivot. The equivalent technique on a wired network would be literally like unplugging an authorized device from the wall, connecting to a hostile network on which you can attack it. The reason why this works is that port-based. Yeah, I love that movie. So the reason why this attack works is that port-based access controls, they rely on the assumption that the physical layer can be trusted. In a wireless network, WPA2 EAP is the means through which the integrity of the physical layer is protected. When a weak form of WPA2 EAP is used, this means the attacker can actually freely control the physical layer, and by doing this actually renders port-based NAC mechanisms useless. What this demonstrates is that port-based NAC mechanisms, they don't effectively mitigate the risk presented by weak WPA2 EAP implementations. And furthermore, it also demonstrates that adding port-based NAC mechanisms to wireless networks, that does not make the use of EAP TTLS or EAP PEEP any less inappropriate if the network in question is used to grant access to sensitive information. So, before we wrap this up, I'm going to make one last kind of case for using EAP TLS. It's really not as bad as it used to be. You can actually leverage group policy quite extensively to configure 802.1x clients. Your best options really to use a private CA to leverage AD as much as possible to deploy EAP TLS. And you can even distribute the server cert to clients. If you're like in a BYOD situation, you can use a really streamlined BYOD onboarding solution or an MDM to distribute the certs that way. And actually, you can even use Let's Encrypt, although like even on Let's Encrypt's website, they're like, this is probably not the best way to do this. But I mean, that is an option as well. So just some closing thoughts. Just because wireless and wired networks operate in the same way at the logical level, it's important to remember that they don't necessarily operate the same way at the physical level. So that's something to keep in mind when designing security controls for wireless networks. And also as a community, we really should question whether it's truly a sound business decision to neglect EAP TLS in favor of a more reactive approach that focuses on access control and threat containment. And finally, if there's one thing to take away from this talk, it's that the needs for security and convenience are really often at odds with one another. So it's really important to maintain a healthy skepticism towards solutions that really promise to be both of those. Thank you. Time for questions? Okay, any questions? No questions? All right, cool. We got the slides. Shoot, actually, like I don't know where the slides are yet. I guess like check the Hackfest Twitter because I'll like just tweet it at them and then the slides will be there. Does that work? All right, cool, awesome. Saw some other hands over there. Okay, anyone else? No? Really? All right. That was easy.